Let's talk about trans-regional networks of communication and exchange. That is a very boring way to say that people are getting together in ways they're trading goods and resources in ways they've never been able to do so before. All right? So a dramatic change from that first period of world history when empires were really small or non-existent, where civilizations were locally based. Now we're having what we call trans-regional networks. That prefix trans means across, okay? Like going across something. So we're going across regions. This is, or this could be called inter-regional, all right? Rather than intra-regional. Inter-regional or trans-regional trade networks, going across trade networks. There's a few that you need to know according to the AP's curriculum, and you guys have already heard of most of these. First, the big red one. The big red one, we call that? Silk Road, very good. You should notice about the Silk Road that it is primarily what kind of trade route? It is a land-based trade route. That's going to come important to our story as we talk later in the year about Mongols and such. So the Silk Road is a land-based trade route. I also want you to notice about the Silk Road, and if we were to zoom in even more on this map, it would become more evident. The Silk Road is not a road. All right? The Silk Road is not a road. It's a network of roads. It's a network of routes. It's many connections to different places. So the Silk Road is going to have a lot of veer-offs and branches. It's all considered a part of the Silk Road network. Because regardless of if it's going from here all the way to the Roman world, or if it's veering off, what is still an important commodity being traded on the Silk Road? Silk. And it's connecting the Eastern world to the areas further west. So it is not one road, but that's a snappy title that we can give for the Silk Road network. Think of I-75 from Detroit down to Orlando, and if you guys have ever driven on that horrible drive all the way down to Florida. There is that one main artery that's going to get you there, but there's many offshoots and many different connections to different cities and locales as you get there. The Silk Road would be much the same. We're going to talk about, and I don't have any lines on this one, we're going to talk about some trans-Saharan trade networks. Again, trans is across. So across the Saharan Desert. Yes, sir.
I'm just gonna say, I find it ironic that, for example, for the Silk Road to be primarily based in China.
Yeah.
How, merchants are traditionally viewed very poorly.
Absolutely. Right. But even though the merchants in Chinese culture don't really have high regard within China, they are vital to not only China's well-being throughout its history, but also the rest of the world that wants to connect with China. So those merchants are going to be valued not just by, or they might be undervalued within China, but they're going to have some high value with the people that they're making contact with. One other note about most of these trade routes, a merchant is rarely going to hop on the Silk Road and then make his way by himself all the way across. All right? We're going to have dozens or hundreds even of small connection points in a route that is this far. This is almost half the Earth, right? So that is a long trade route. Yes, ma'am?
I have a question. Why is there a little red in Egypt and Africa, but is suffering?
I can't explain that. I don't know.
The Nile River
Well, that's getting on the Nile. I know why. I can't explain it now. So the blue are sea routes. The red are land routes. So this is how one gets down. He goes down the Nile, then you've got to hop across the land to get to the Red Sea. All right? I just figured something out right there. Because, of course, back in the classical world, what does not exist that exists today? Today we can have a nice blue line going from the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea. Anyone? A canal called? The Suez Canal. Very good. You guys might have heard of that, Suez Canal. That connects the Mediterranean Sea to the Red Sea.
Yeah, and it's traditionally, our water routes preferred?
Oh, yeah, they're usually pretty quick. Quicker compared to land routes. Yes?
The whole thing is the Silk Road?
No. This land route is the Silk Road.
The Silk Road is completely
All right.
land.
Trans-Saharan trade network we're going to talk about an Indian Ocean trade network, and that's these blue sea routes here. And then we're going to talk about some Mediterranean sea lanes that are going to connect North Africa and the Mediterranean. So this is what we're going to talk about. Let's do it. First, the Silk Road. Obviously a connection point from China to the West. When I'm talking about the West at this beginning chunk of AP World History, when I talk about the West, we're talking about the Roman Empire. All right? Eventually, when we talk about the West, we're going to talk about specifically Western Europe and the United States. But right now, the West is the Roman Empire. Because that's another important thing to remember. There is absolutely, at this point in history, zero contact between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. All right? There is no contact whatsoever. Once that land bridge disappears, once the last ice age ends, there is no contact between the Eastern Hemisphere and the Western Hemisphere. So the Americas, kind of interestingly, everything that the Americas are doing, they're doing on their own. They are the one sole civilization group that is developing independent. Whereas, like in South Asia, they're having contacts with Chinese civilizations and the Greek world under Alexander, for example. All right? Everybody's having contacts over here. They might be direct contacts. They might be secondary contacts or tertiary contacts. What? Like you're a couple steps away. Like these guys might contact with these guys who are contacting with these guys. So in effect, these guys can get stuff from them. But it's just taken a couple hops. But in the Americas, there's no contact with this Eastern world, and make sure we understand that. There are some historians that people believe now are crackpot historians that say that there were very early contacts between maybe Asia or African civilizations and the Americas, but that doesn't hold a lot of historical credibility right now. So maybe we'll find something someday that says there was a lot more, but nothing going on that we know of now.
Well, if you're talking about like Eastern Hemisphere being like much more connected than the Western
Yes.
was, then does Australia count? Like I don't think we discussed.
Australia is kind of on its own right now.
Oh, okay.
Australia is pretty isolated right now. What's that? They're not a thing yet. We're not talking about them yet. All right. So Silk Road, it's a land-based trade network. It connects East Asia to the Middle East, or as AP World likes to call the Middle East, Southwest Asia, and the Eastern Mediterranean. If you are not absolutely 100% clear with your never eat soggy waffles, you've got to get there like now. All right? So are we all 100% clear? Because we're going to be using these cardinal directions, right? And you've got to be able to figure them out when you look at a map, where north is, and where south is, and where east is, and where west is. All right?
Could you repeat the region?
Did you guys catch that?
The region?
Was that right? No, so call me out, okay? North, south, west, okay. Make sure you're good with that. All right. Yeah. East Asia, South Asia, that's India. When we talk about South Asia, we're talking about the Indian subcontinent. South Asia to the Eastern Mediterranean, which brings you into the Roman Empire. Obviously, the goods that are in most demand are going to be Chinese goods coming out of this, like tea and silk. Wait a minute. We don't call it the Silk Road for any other reason besides they traded silk on it? That's about it.
And tea was another one, right?
Yep. And porcelain coming later as well. These are goods that are going to be in high demand in the Western world because these people in the West, they don't know how to make silk. They don't know how to make silk. They don't produce tea leaves. So they've got to have those contacts. And so what we're going to find, 1 second really quick, to remind you of some of the mercantilist ideas that you talked about last year in AP World History. We are going to see a flow of gold and silver that goes to the east and is dropped into Chinese empires with goods like silk and tea coming out. So these guys are right. There's not a whole lot from over here that China needs. All right? And we're going to keep that in mind as we push through the entire year. Yes, ma'am. I had a hand back there. Go ahead, Mina. Anybody, Mina.
Would you say like that's why like China is so big on the whole like made in China thing? Like there's all that stuff made in China. Is that like included?
I think we're pretty separate. I think we're pretty separate from that. But like silk production is a highly labor-intensive task. So is tea production. And what does China have a lot of then and now? They've got a lot of labor. They've got a lot of people to work. Yes, sir.
I was going to connect this to later on in history. Like, not many people know about this. Like, probably not many people know about this.
Just say it.
I can study it. So you said that they so-called that China doesn't need much, right?
Yeah.
Like the only reason why they get gold and silver is because the other traders have nothing to trade with.
Right.
So that you can connect that later to the Opium War, which is when
Absolutely.
England tried to trade opium.
Absolutely, because England wanted to hold on to their gold and silver. Absolutely, very good. For those of you that aren't familiar with the Opium Wars, we will get there in about 4 months, 5 months.
That's like
we'll get there.
That's like period 5.
Yeah, we're gonna get there. Yes, sir.
Isn't silk made from like spider webs?
Worms, silk worms, like little caterpillar dudes, right?
Is it because they don't have the silkworms and they don't know how to make silk?
What's that?
For the Europeans, it's because they don't
Yeah.
have silkworms.
Yeah, exactly.
They don't know how to make silk.
All right, we're also going to deal with the Indian Ocean Trade Network. The Indian Ocean Trade Network. And here's like the classic map of the Indian Ocean Trade Network. We see connections between East Africa and the Middle East and the Indian subcontinent, but then also connecting over into Indonesia. And the Silk Network, the Indian Ocean trade routes, these are sea-based routes, of course.
Which is actually pretty favorable, because you get ships that's much faster than land.
Absolutely. And the primary commodity that's being traded here are going to be spices from the East Indies. Spices from South Asia, spices from Ceylon, which is today called Sri Lanka, connecting with East Asia, or East Africa. Yes, sir?
If the traders were so close to like Australia, why did you never like discover?
Eventually there will come in contact, okay? The earliest classical period trade routes are primarily over here, with some connections on the east, not going that far to the south.
It connects West Africa, South Asia, and Southeast Asia.
Right. And one other distortion on this for the classical period, these routes kind of skipping along are more so what we would see in the classical period. It's going to be a while before we're taking like direct oversea routes, getting that far away from the coast where you can't see where you're going. There would be adaptations for the seasons based on monsoon winds. Monsoon winds in the Eastern Hemisphere are seasonal winds that would, and you can see here, from April to September, so like in the summer months, you would be doing your trade from East Africa to India, and then on the opposite side of the calendar, you'd be coming back, all right? So your ships would follow these seasonal winds. Here's a continuity, or a change at least, that we can connect from a very early trading period on the Indian Ocean to much later trading periods on the Indian Ocean, as we have more advanced ships in the future that aren't so dictated by the direction of the winds, especially the development of steamships eventually, completely can disregard those monsoons.
Before I had a question. Like,
Yeah.
Before steamships, like before the steam engines, so
Yep.
was it completely reliant on?
Not completely. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Not completely, but certainly it was much faster to go with the winds. A brief mention of trans-Saharan trade networks. It's across the Saharan Desert, connecting North Africa to this green chunk of Africa. This massive chunk of Africa, northern Africa, that's the Sahara Desert. It's the biggest desert in the world, right? This is another land-based trade route connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the southern Mediterranean. And primary commodities traded over this route are going to be gold and salt. But we will also see some slave trade, even as early as the classical period.
So, sub-Saharan Africa to Mediterranean?
To the northern Africa and connecting to the Mediterranean routes. How do you think you get across the Sahara Desert?
Caravan.
Very good. Camel caravans. A caravan is just a group of camels that you're going to be using to help you get your stuff across a desert.
What are they based on? What are the routes based on? Like what material?
Gold and salt.
Gold and salt.
And in its earliest days in the classical period, it could take 70 to 90 days to get a camel caravan across the Mediterranean desert. I know, the Lions. Blame anything I say today on the Detroit Lions and making me stay up until the bitter end to watch that ridiculous finish. The Mediterranean desert, there's no such thing. It would take 70 to 90 days to get your camel caravan across the Sahara Desert. All right? Yes?
Okay, so I didn't actually realize how salt was actually valuable back then.
Yes. Salt is tremendously valuable for all of human history. It's one of the most valuable commodities that you could ever trade, especially before refrigerators existed, because it was how you preserved food. So if you ever notice, if you get I don't know, beef sticks or something like that, beef jerky or something like that, they can be very heavily salted. They can be very salted. Salt is used in canned foods or in food that will survive on your shelf for a year or 2 or 3. They tend to have very, very high salt content because salt acts as a preservative for those foods. And in history, you would have, if you had a pig, that pig would rot after you slaughtered it very quickly. So you buried it in a barrel of salt, and then you would have this salt pork. And then you can imagine, and the salt would preserve it. It would leach it of a lot of its moisture, obviously, but it would preserve that meat. It wouldn't rot with it when it's buried in the salt. But you can imagine how that's going to taste. So let's add in another commodity of these classical world trade networks: the spices coming from East Asia to give some better flavor to the food that you've destroyed with salt.
Because I thought that salt was commonly found in oceans, right? I didn't know it was that rare.
It is commonly found in oceans, but when it's in oceans, it's wet. It's in water. And we don't have, at this time period, very effective ways to extract the salt from oceans. So the salt we're talking about is the salt that you sprinkle on your food, the salt that you might sprinkle on your driveway. It's mined salt. It's salt that comes from under the earth. It's a mineral that is extracted from the earth.
Oh, so today's salt isn't even from the ocean anymore.
Well, there's sea salt that people use today, but the majority of the table salt that you guys have is coming from salt mines. Yeah.
Because I thought that it wasn't that bad, because I thought all you had to do was get it in a lot of ocean water, put it in the barrels, and let it dry out, and then you get salt. But
I mean, that's a way to get salt, but the majority of salt's coming from mines underground.
okay,
Did you guys know Detroit? The city of Detroit is sitting on top of one of the biggest salt mines in the world, and so we chug out huge amounts of salt out of caverns underneath the city of Detroit. So yeah, it's where most of it comes from. It's far faster to take a chisel and a hammer and knock out a piece of salt from under the earth than it is to lay a bunch of seawater over a massive plain and let that water evaporate and then scrape off the salt that you would have at the bottom. Far more efficient to do it the old-fashioned mining way. Okay, we need to press on, or we are never going to get beyond salt, and then you guys are going to be in trouble. All right. Mediterranean sea routes. Mediterranean sea routes. Obviously connecting the Roman Empire connecting, and before Rome, connecting the Greek world, or even the Phoenicians. We mentioned those people who were sea travelers over the Mediterranean Sea. But essentially, what does the Mediterranean do? It's connecting North Africa, who's connected to sub-Saharan Africa via trans-Saharan trade routes. It's connecting Southern Europe, who's connected via trade routes from Northern Europe. It's connecting the Southwest Asian Middle East to East Asia via the Silk Road. So all of those commodities that are coming in from all of these various trade networks can then be transported on the Mediterranean Sea. Within the Mediterranean, it connects all of the world together. The Mediterranean Sea, a couple specific commodities that we're going to have traded over here. You read a little bit about like the olive oil that will be produced in the Greek world, traded throughout the Mediterranean. And one hugely important commodity that the Romans are going to be trading on the Mediterranean Sea route, with themselves, largely, like Italy is going to get a lot of its cotton from Egypt, Egyptian cotton. A lot of cotton produced in Egypt. So that will make its way throughout the Roman world via Mediterranean Sea routes.
Didn't Egypt, like, what was going on in Egypt at this point? Was it dominated by the Romans?
Depends on what point you're talking about. Early on, it's Egyptian kingdoms. Eventually, Egyptian kingdoms are going to be taken over by Alexander the Great, and then they become Alexander's kingdom for 10 years. Then Alexander dies, and he leaves off his empire to some generals. And so one of his generals, a guy named Ptolemy, is going to be ruling Egypt. This is like Cleopatra's line. And so now it's like a Greekish Egypt. And eventually, Egypt falls under the power of the Roman Empire. So that's it.
So at this point, it's like you said cotton was traded between the within the Roman Empire.
Yeah, so I'm kind of focusing on Rome here, but even before, cotton's going to make its way out of Egypt. All right, how are we? Can I press on? I want to make sure you guys have enough time to do what you need to do. How are we doing all of this trade? How are we making all these long distance connections? A lot of this is tied to new technologies that would be developed during this period. First and foremost, I got a yoke for you. Kind of sounds like a joke, but it's a yoke, all right? Not a yoke with an L, those are in eggs. This is a yoke with just a K and an E, which you put on pack animals, domesticated pack animals. Here is one stark difference, if we're comparing civilizations, between the Eastern Hemisphere world and the Western Hemisphere world. The Eastern Hemisphere has all kinds of domesticated pack animals. When I talk about domesticated pack animals, we are talking about domesticated animals that you can pack a lot of crap onto and they can carry it. Like horses, we have. Mules, they're going to figure out. Yes? Mules. Camels. There's two kinds of camels, dromedaries and two-hump. Bactrian. The Bactrian. Those are the hairy camels. And they live up in the cold deserts, in the Gobi Desert. Camels. Oxen, right? You guys all know oxen because you play Scrabble, and sometimes that word is needed. Okay, good. So this is a yoke. This is a yoke. A yoke can be put around the heads of maybe two oxen. And then it can be connected to a cart that is using those very handy wheels developed in the earlier neoclassical era. Or Neolithic era, pardon me. And they can pull things that they may not have otherwise been able to pull before. So now it could become cost effective, rather than sending some guy with a bag on his shoulders. Now it could be cost effective to actually trade over long distance routes, land routes especially. So yokes are a development of this classical period that will allow for greater long distance travel. Also saddles. Seems like a really basic thing, but saddles will be developed during like the very early classical period and beyond. Saddles with maybe stirrups even connected to them, which will allow guys on horseback to travel far further than they'd ever traveled before. And it seems so obvious, and we've got to be very careful about this. These things seem so obvious. Like you look at an ox, And you're like, yeah, of course you would throw that on him. But everything is obvious to a world that already has these things, right? An iPhone today seems obvious. But when we got our first iPhones, we were like, what? That's crazy, right? So every development that we have, that we live with, seems obvious, seems basic. But at one time, it didn't exist. And it's going to take someone to think of it and to do it and be like, oh yeah, that's a good idea. And guess what happens as we're starting to make inter-regional connections or trans-regional connections? Some guy, the first guy that ever throws a yoke onto a couple oxen, is going to take some long-distance travel, and guess what people in his destination are going to see? Wow, look at that yoke. That's a pretty cool yoke. I think I should use a yoke like that. And he looks at it, and he takes out his camera and takes a picture. No, he doesn't do that, but maybe he draws a picture of it, right? And he replicates it. And what do we call this when technology is maybe going to go from one chunk of the world down to another chunk of the world? Cultural diffusion. Very good. So yokes and saddles. Also, we're going to have some innovations on the open seas. We've always had boats. But now we're going to develop some improved sails that will help us to do some things that we didn't think boats could originally do. Early sailing vessels used square sails. Square sails are really good for picking up the wind and pushing you in the direction that the wind is blowing. But in the classical period, we're going to start to see the development of triangular sails called lateen sails. L-A-T-E-E-N. Lateen sails. Triangular sails that can allow a ship to tack against the wind. What that means, essentially, is it can allow a ship to sail into the wind. Now, of course, what is faster? Sailing with the wind or using lateen sails to tack against the wind? With the wind. Because when you're going with the wind, like if the wind is blowing this way and you have a square sail and you let that blow you, you will go that way as fast as the wind is going to push you. With a lateen sail, you're going to have to tack against the wind. So if the wind is blowing this way, you're going to have to sail kind of across the wind, back and forth, continually turning your sail back and forth to more slowly push you along. But guess what? You can still go that direction. So a lateen sail are going to be developed first in the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean basin that allow sailors to tack against the wind or to sail against the wind.
Would it still be like really tedious to do that?
Yeah, I mean, not as fast as going with the wind, but sometimes the wind doesn't cooperate with you. This is a ship that was prominent in the Indian Ocean trade network between East Africa and South Asia. This is called a Dhow, D-H-O-W. It's just a narrow sailing vessel that employs these lateen sails, primarily used by Arab traders and East African traders on the Indian Ocean Trade Network. It's called a Dhow, D-H-O-W, or a Dhow ship. And of course, we want to remember that the Indian Ocean Trade Network wouldn't exist without those monsoon winds. Predictable, prevailing winds that were seasonally based that made it easier to trade long distances on the Indian Ocean.
Could you repeat that?
Monsoon winds.
Monsoon
Strong seasonal winds made trade easier. Don't ever try to write everything I say word for word. Everybody good? So would you maybe in a couple days be able to spit back a couple technological innovations that are going to enhance or allow inter-regional or trans-regional trade to take place? Yes? Good. Going to close off with talking about how the results of these trans-regional trade. Yes, stuff is going to make it from point A to point B. Yes, we're going to have some cultural diffusion from these different networks that connect with each other. A couple specific things that you guys might be able to attach to a future essay you might write is we're going to see some crops spread around the world. Did you guys remember me mentioning at the very beginning of the year that one of the reasons that the Middle East or Southwest Asia becomes what we call the cradle of civilization, one of the reasons Mesopotamia becomes one of the earliest places in the world with settled agriculture, is because the Mesopotamian area, that area of Southwest Asia, was particularly blessed by having native grains, a majority of the world's native consumable grains, the things we eat, the wheat, the barley and such, the oats and all the different native grains that we can actually consume as human beings. Most of them come from here. They had a handful in East Asia, they had a handful in North Africa, they had a handful in the Americas. That's where corn comes from. That's another one of those edible grains. But they had majority of them, something like 30 some out of the 50 that existed in the world, in the Middle East. Well, obviously now, like the other day, I made myself some Spanish rice, which is kind of like Mexican flavored rice. Well, rice doesn't originate here. Rice has got to make its way around the world. So rice, which starts in Southeast or in East Asia, is going to diffuse. And it's going to make its way because of these trade networks. And it'll connect to South Asia, but it'll eventually go to the Middle East. So when you go and eat some Lebanese food at a Lebanese restaurant, you might very well get some rice with that meal, right? Yes, you will. Very good. And eventually, we go to a Mexican restaurant, and we get rice with our meal because of cultural diffusion. In addition to just crops spreading, we're going to see a spread of irrigation techniques and ideas. And this is one that the AP wants you to be sure you know about. And I might butcher the pronunciation, but it's the Qanat system, the Qanat, Q-A-N-A-T. The Qanat system. It's a way, let's say hypothetically, you have an aquifer. You guys know what an aquifer is, right? It's an underground water resource. And let's say, fortunately, because gravity is on your side, we have an aquifer that's located under a hill. An aquifer down here is really tough to deal with. But if it's located under a hill, we can work with that. Because you can dig this Qanat channel that is going to connect the area that you might be living in to this underground hilled aquifer. And then gravity is just going to do its thing. You're basically creating an earthen pipe, right? That's going to take water from that aquifer that you otherwise wouldn't be able to easily pump up because you don't have pumps. So we're going to just make it, let gravity do its thing. Dig a channel, dig some access valves so it can help us, but we're going to get that water out. Now we can irrigate further. This is born in the Middle East, but it's going to spread to other areas that are in contact with the Middle East. Yes, ma'am? I do want to know how to say it, and I think the world wants to know. Say it out loud. Qanat. Qanat. Wait, say it. Qanat. Qanat. Is that good? Channel. Awesome. So when you go home, you might say, Mom, where's the remote? I want to change the Qanat. You would use the same word? What? I was making that up. But it's the same channel word. Because it connected with English and we had a word for like channels and you were like, hey, we already got a word for channel. Really interesting. That's really, I'm so happy. I love teaching my class. Yes.
This looks like a thing that's very difficult to construct without machine work.
Yes. Look what people can do when they are organized in a civilization,
Aliens.
right? This is not one guy that's digging this thing for himself. This is a team of people that are working it out, right?
How long does this thing take?
I don't know. 43 days. I don't know. All right, everybody good? Hey, necessity, they say, is the mother of invention. Or innovation, but it sounds better when you say necessity is the mother of invention. And so when you need food, because you have a growing population, you might figure out a way to get that water out. You do. Now, do you think there's a lot of people that tried and failed? Probably. Then they figured out something better. So this actually developed in Persia, and it would spread out throughout the Middle East. Thank you for teaching me about that word. Unfortunately, not everything that travels over trade networks is a good thing. When human beings come in contact with each other, we sometimes take nasty things. As every parent of elementary school kids knows, when kids go back to school and they run into all these germy other kids, kids get sick in the fall. They bring home a lot of new germs that they hadn't been in contact with over the summertime. Well, when we have long-distance trade networks, connecting East Asia, for example, with the Roman world and everything in between, we're also going to be spreading some nasty diseases. Things like smallpox and measles are going to make their way across the same Silk Roads that silk and tea will be making their way across. And both China and the Roman Empire will suffer some pretty nasty epidemics of these diseases. And each of those epidemics that they will suffer from are going to be in part a cause of two effects. Nasty diseases kill people. Nasty diseases cause population declines. I think I've already mentioned this. Population declines in empires cause what to happen in empires? The collapse of empires. So these diseases are going to be one reason that we will talk about the collapse of empires. All right? In addition to that, though, we have another side effect. As people are dying from diseases that maybe are previously unfamiliar to them, they might start getting a little freaked out. And when people get freaked out and can't understand what's happening to them, where do they turn? They might turn to their government. I don't know about that. The government ain't helping them very much. They might turn to religion. But since their religion, their traditional religion, might not be doing anything for them, they might start to turn to new religious ideas in hope of some salvation, in hope of some escape. Or at least in hope of some belief that can help you comfort you in trying times. So it should come as no surprise to you that at the same time that China is dealing with smallpox epidemics and Rome is dealing with smallpox epidemics, we're going to see a growth in China of a new religion, which is Buddhism in China. We'll see a growth at this time of crisis. We're also going to see a growth in Rome of Christianity at this time of crisis. Everybody good? Questions, comments, concerns? Thank you.